accelerated over the last few years, particularly with COVID. And the public sector has a responsibility to continue that growth. And I'll give you a great example. My company, ServiceNow, we are doing a partnership with Naval Postgraduate School where we're taking our low-code, no-code software, and we're teaching the grad students how to code on it. But then in turn, they're launching a challenge to bring in some of the students from the Salinas Valley, which grows some of our most amazing fruits and vegetables. If you like salads, you like artichokes, you like asparagus, it's grown in the Salinas Valley. But a lot of those kids, their parents are first-generation Americans, and they're field workers and they're laborers. And so their educational outcomes are sometimes secondary to the outcomes of the kids on the west side of the peninsula, where I live. So you think Carmel, Pebble Beach, where you see all the golf tournaments. The income inequity is huge. So what we're doing is we're working with this NPS, which is here on the peninsula, to have a science challenge to teach those kids how to code. And in the same breath, we're bringing in multiple individuals from a variety of technology to talk to them about how the careers in technology might look. And one example is I'm a technologist, but I'm not. So I grew up as an HR guy in the Air Force, and now I'm a CTO. Well, how did that journey happen? So I'm sharing that story, that you don't have to be a STEM person to really capture and understand what tech is. So demystification is one of the things we can do by showing how technology isn't just the guys and gals who are sitting in there doing the coding. There's, we have, Megan here. She's in tech, but she works for KPMG, and she's probably doing delivery of projects. And that's part of technology. So widening the aperture and giving people an understanding of what technology is the first step in doing that.
Great. Yeah, I resemble that remark, Kevin, because I am not a technologist either. So let's go to the second question, which is for Kevin. When it comes to data and analytics, how can analytics inform incorporation of equity across different mission objectives?
Someone kicked that to Dan. I think that's more in his lane.
Okay. Dan?
And Dan, you're on mute.
There we go. Thanks so much. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Joyce. Thanks, Jackie, too, as well. And thanks very quickly to ACT-IAC for hosting such an important accelerator and conversation today. So really the question on how technology can really sort of accelerate equity and also really be able to sort of learn from and utilize the data that exists out there, I think really can be found on some of the emerging technology that exists in the market today, and see how that technology is actually being used. So I can kind of speak to where I see data and sort of emerging technology being able to advance these type of outcomes. So first and foremost, I think that when you're talking about talent acquisition in particular, and you're talking about equity, and by that definition of equity, we're talking about ensuring consistent, systematic, fair, and impartial outcomes for individuals as part of that talent acquisition process. I think it really first starts with making sure that the humans in the loop, whether it's job seekers themselves or hiring managers or recruiters, have the most informed, complete set of data to make the best decisions possible to them. So from the job seeker standpoint, that really allows them to first identify the right job for them, the job that they should actually apply to. All too often today, we start with a keyword search, which presupposes that we know what we're looking for. And then we're left to interpret vaguely worded job descriptions and self-assess against those. And unfortunately, most people get that wrong, especially people that haven't done those roles before, which has a big impact on equity, diversity, inclusion within the workforce. From a hiring manager standpoint, like job descriptions, resumes don't really provide a poor articulation of potential of those individuals. So having a more complete set of data on the candidate's skill sets and potential allows them to move into that space more effectively and equitably. I think number two is that this now emphasis on skills versus even pedigree, I think has a tremendous impact, where data plays a very critical role The fact really is that you can tell a lot of the skills that individual has by what they have done previously before in the past, in their past roles in their education. But where things get really interesting is through the use of, say, artificial intelligence or other emerging technologies, where you can take those skill sets and look at skill adjacencies. So if somebody knows skill A, do they know skill B? Could they learn skill C? And really, for the first time ever, this starts to unlock potential. And really, oftentimes, that concept of potential really means that you're providing new opportunities for people that haven't been considered before for those roles, and you're diversifying the overall pipeline. And this is where data can play an important role into providing those type of insights. And then I'll say the number 3 thing here, and I'll just allow the other panelists to add to this if they need to, is that also too much data sometimes can be a bad thing. So oftentimes we want to, it makes sense to obfuscate data. And so being able to look at data that doesn't necessarily need to be part of that decision loop, things like PII data, being able to remove the name, the gender, the race, oftentimes from the evaluation of the candidate is an important consideration that when combined with a true understanding of skills and potential, really allow individuals to start making decisions based off of merits of the candidates, rather than any of that unconscious bias that may be still pervasive in today's hiring environment. So I'll pause there, and hopefully that answers your question. Okay.
Thank you very much. Anybody have any comments to this question? We're running ahead of time, so we have time for comments.
Yeah, if I can, Joyce. Dan, thank you so much for bringing that up. Blind resume reviews, as I like to simplify it in a phrase, is something that we've been trying to champion in the NSF OIG. I think it's super important. I know that it would be a heavy lift outside of technology to do that by hand, but we have a small enough office here where we're starting to do that as a pilot to see how that works out, and hopefully collect that information to see if it's really benefiting the DEIA efforts that we're trying to move forward with at the OIG and at NSF. So thanks for bringing that up.
And also, Dan, I think we also know that sometimes AI can have unintended consequences. So, in the area of doing equity, I think, de-anonymizing a lot of those applications and being able to put them in so you actually are getting a skill level as opposed to, personality or person application. I think that would be very valuable as well.
Absolutely, 100%. I think really, with artificial intelligence in particular, I think it's very important to be extremely purposeful and to really understand how the AI is being used, because, if you're training AI on biased data or you're using it in ways that may be sort of adjacent to pseudoscience, well, then you may just be re-perpetuating bias and unfortunately doing so with great efficiency and scale. I think really the promise that artificial intelligence really can provide here is truly understanding and surfacing skills and presenting those skills and those skill adjacencies to unlock potential, to showcase that to a hiring manager so that they can have a greater understanding of those individuals and understand where they can fit within an organization. Really, and the best way I could put it is that if we can use artificial intelligence in a way that essentially augments the human in the loop and gives them that full set of data, then really they're benefiting from in making better decisions from a full source of data that they might not normally have.
Absolutely. Great. Anybody else have any comment? Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan, and we appreciate your comments. Megan, what approaches and best practices can agencies establish across their programs to incorporate equity in their decision-making, procedures, and processes?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joyce. And I'll just start by admitting to Kevin's point, not only am I a technologist hiding in a professional services firm, I'm actually a clinical social worker by training. So even a less likely candidate to be here having a technology conversation. So to your point around what agencies can be doing to sort of bake in equity. And so from my perspective, we at KPMG developed what we call the health equity flywheel. And we use it to both inform how we help our clients solve some of these problems around, addressing equity, but also how we do our own work. And it centers around these three nodes of the flywheel: learn with, act with, and design with. And really the fundamental piece there is sort of co-creation. So if you are trying to solve challenges around equity and you look around the room and there's no one making those decisions who represents the populations you're trying to address, you sort of miss the point to some extent. And research bears this out, right? We've seen lots of evidence around the most sustainable, longest lasting solutions. And they really need to have this partnership baked into it. Now, I'll readily admit that is one of the hardest things to do and to do well. It takes a lot of time and energy to identify those communities, build those relationships in really meaningful ways. But we do think it's worth the time and the energy that it takes to really get it right. So I always say not for, but with. So if you're really trying to sort of tackle those equity challenges, I think that's really fundamental to how you need to be addressing the problems.
And Joyce, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. So Javier, we'll come to you. As emerging technologies begin to support equity initiatives across government, there may be a lot of new data that is surfaced that can spur questions around DEIA. And for anybody who does not know, the acronym is for diversity, equity, inclusiveness, and access. With the surfacing of this new data and information, organizations often look to compare notes to assess potential patterns and brainstorm on new approaches. How can agencies best collaborate and learn from each other when it comes to DEIA to turn data into real information that people and teams can work with?
Thanks, Joyce. Appreciate the question. I think it's one of those where I have to provide I have to make a preface here. And before we talk about the data or new data that could be utilized, from a workforce perspective, we need to be aware that in the federal government, the submission of demographic data is strictly voluntary. And we have a significant issue across the federal enterprise on trying to get that point across of how important it is to collect this information. So I believe we need to start by educating our workforce, but also our potential workforce, right? Because applicant flow data is important, of why we need to collect this data, why it's important, how it's going to be utilized, that it's not going to be utilized for any nefarious purpose, that we do it not to discriminate, but in fact to help and hopefully promote the DEIA path forward or strategic plan of our respective agencies. So Executive Order 14035, which was signed by the president in June of last year, requires that agencies assess the status of their DEIA initiatives or programs and to review the amount of institutional resources available. So basically provide the necessary resources in order to move that strategic plan forward. The strategic plans were submitted, hopefully, or at least the requirement was to submit them by the end of March of this year. And consideration should be given to meeting the objectives outlined in that executive order, as well as the goals and objectives outlined by each agency in their individual strategic plan. There may be opportunities for us to utilize emerging technologies to help agencies accelerate the identification of what's already available, so that creative opportunities for incorporating DEIA can be identified at the enterprise, program, and even the team levels of each agency. I think information sharing amongst agencies is super important. I don't think we do enough of that across the enterprise. I do think that there is a way to establish some of these collaborative organizations or collaborative paths to share promising practices. I don't say best practices. I think promising practices is a better term, right? And that's not just in the government, right? We could also include universities, NGOs, and even public-private partnerships. I know that ACT-IAC has an upcoming podcast, which will provide more insight on how these collaborative partnerships can be formed. I think agencies are also moving toward publicly publishing information on their DEI plans. I know a lot of the agencies, including the National Science Foundation, has published their plan on their website. I believe a lot of them have done that as well throughout the federal enterprise. But it's not just a check the box initiative, right? And that's something that we really need to be cognizant of. It's not just, the latest and greatest. It's not just, the flavor of the month or the flavor of the year, or even the flavor of the administration, right? We need to make sure that these plans are set up and executed in a way that they're what I would call, respectfully, administration agnostic, right? We need to make sure that we inculcate DEIA in the operational fabric of our agencies so that it's, just something that we do on a regular basis, whether it's blind resume review, looking at the data, making sure that we're utilizing the data appropriately, making sure that we're not using it, as I mentioned before, for nefarious purposes. And I think there's, an opportunity for us to learn across the enterprise within the federal government, as well as across the private sector, to make sure that we are utilizing these emerging technologies in a way that advances and not limits our efforts. And what I mean by that is that, we talk about upskilling and reskilling. A lot of folks that I've talked to, are a little nervous about this, right? It's the same people, or potentially the same people today, that some time ago were nervous about the change from paper-based operations to, digitizing workflows, right? And I'm not sure we did a great job of upskilling and reskilling that workforce at the time. And now we have to do it almost on steroids, right? So I think there needs to be a way to ensure that we're communicating across all of our organizations, develop those promising practices, and then execute, and then look at what we've done over the past few months, year, et cetera, and then adjust fire as we need to make sure that what we're doing is actually working and hitting the mark.
Absolutely, Javier, I think you hit the nail on the head there. First of all, codifying this so that it's not something that's based on a administration or an organization is extremely important, and we need to get that done. Second of all, I empathize because I was a political appointee, and when they come out with these executive orders, these career peoples go, "Oh my God, something else, an unfunded mandate," and they roll their eyes in their head. And those of us who are political appointees, we get, yay, a project to get done, and off we go. So I think there has to be a meeting of the minds in which we can hopefully get the political appointees and the career people on the same page to satisfy the same goal. Any comments?
I'll just chime in one thing. To Javier's point about making this codifying and continuing to make sure it's not something that's administrative agnostic. I think there's hope, because as Gen Z enters the workforce, they're going to demand these things. The things we're talking about right now at our age is still adjusting. It's what they're living. They're living an equitable future, and they want to demand, they're going to demand that. So the workforce will drive a lot of this. And so part of our goal is sitting here in leadership roles right now is to make sure that we are starting to do the change management of the workforce that exists today, to be able to accept those ideas that are going to come with workers who are coming in over the next few years.
I also have another question for Javier. Javier, in your communication and collaboration, have you talked with Census and how they got people to respond to the 2020 census across cultural barriers? Talk to NIH about how they got people in underserved communities to sign up to take the COVID vaccine. It sounds like that's what you are advocating, so that people fill out these forms so that they can be counted, if you will.
Yeah, my previous role prior to coming to the IG, I was the deputy in the Office of Equity and Civil Rights at NSF, responsible for the DEIA portfolio. So we did have conversations with several agencies, Department of State being one of them, because of their initiative with regarding passport and gender identity and SOGI data, as well as OPM. I think that's something that we also have to move forward with. But I will say this, that it is important that the federal government at the enterprise level establish something, and this is what I would say WAJ, the world according to Javier, right? I think there needs to be a very common nomenclature and common method of collecting this data when it makes sense and where it makes sense, so that as we transition from one agency to another, whether it's Javier or somebody else, you know, that information follows along and it's easily accepted by the new organization. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to collect data across the enterprise that's usable and actionable going forward.
Thank you very much. Catherine, as organizations use emerging technologies to accelerate the incorporation of equity across their enterprise, we may at times find data and information that reveal what we will call today deep truths about different ways underserved or underrepresented communities may not have been supported. How can organizations consider the potential traumas and challenges these communities have experienced and begin to build cultures and environments that are considerate of these challenges?
Thanks so much, Joyce, and thanks everybody. It's really a privilege to be here talking about these topics, and I'm so grateful that you're looking into them. In terms of the question, I think we have to assume that in any interaction with a large group of individuals that we're going to be interacting with people in trauma, the reality is that the majority of adults experiences at least one trauma in their lives, and that is certainly not evenly distributed among racial and ethnic and gender lines. And those numbers are even pre-pandemic. I think in the last few years here in the 2020s, trauma is almost the air that we're breathing. It's really all around us. There are also some types of systems and processes that will, by their nature, be more likely to reach people in trauma. The government system that I have the most experience with is the victim notification system, which DOJ and other agencies use to notify crime victims about matters in their criminal cases. We obviously knew that we would be interacting with large numbers of people in trauma, and that affected a lot of the decisions that we made about the system itself. Obviously, if you are building a system for disaster relief, you are going to assume that the people that you're interacting with are in acute trauma, and some of that might be piling up on many years of trauma, because as we know, disaster tends to hit hardest the people who have suffered the most historically and have the least to give. So I think we have to assume that we are always going to be interacting with people in trauma in the communication systems that we are devising. And in particular, in some systems, we have to know that we are actually targeting people who are in trauma. So what I want to give you is just a little bit of broad brush on how to communicate with people in trauma. This is a huge topic. I wrote a whole book on it. So I'm going to try to distill it into just a few takeaways. One thing I want everybody to know is that when people are in periods of trauma and distress, it's really hard to process information. You've maybe experienced this at times in your own life where, something difficult is happening. Maybe you've had a major loss in your life, and it is really difficult to remember even basic tasks, right? That brain fog. That is the reality for people who are experiencing trauma or acute distress. So it's very, very difficult to process information. And then ironically and unfortunately, it is also a time when we crave information the most. So everybody wants more information. They want to know what's happening, what happens next, how they're supposed to interact, all of that. They crave that information at the very time that they have the most difficulty processing it. So that's challenging, right? It can be really hard. And therefore, my advice on interacting with people in trauma is short, clear sentences. Repeat yourself, say things a lot of times, just over and over again, almost ad nauseum, and follow up. Do it again and again and again. And then the other thing I think that's important to understand about people in trauma is one of the things that's really difficult about a situation where you have experienced something like a major loss or, in a disaster of some kind, is that feeling of being acted upon. that you have lost control of something very important, your life, your plans have been upended, and it's very, very difficult to get a sense of control back. Part of how people try to get control is that gathering information. That's what feeds into that. But also it's important to think about things like others on the panel have mentioned, things like being very careful about how you're using people's information. Don't share information that you don't need to share. Within the victim notification system, we gathered victims' contact information for the purpose of providing them with notifications. There were a lot of other really good reasons that people needed victims' contact information beyond that, but we had said to the victims, we have your information for this one purpose, and we promise you we will not use it for any other. And so despite really great reasons, the answer was a hard no. We are not sharing that information beyond the purpose that we've told them, because that is part of them feeling safe and secure. You've told me how you're using it, and I can trust you that you are using it in that way. Other things like Meg made the point about trying to include voices of people, giving them some autonomy in the system itself and its design, I think is a great idea as well. And also making sure that when people are interacting with the system, just try as much as possible to give them choice. So, for instance, one of the things we did in the victim notification system is we said we have a mandate to provide you with notifications, but we understand that you might have some desire to receive it in a certain way. So some people would want information as quickly as possible and they wanted a text message. That's fine. Some people thought email was better. For some people, what they wanted was to be able to call in when they felt like it, or to have a separate email set up that was only for communication about this case that they could choose to access when they wanted. So on a normally just regular good day, they weren't suddenly being bombarded with an email that reminded them about one of the most horrible incidents in their lives. So wherever possible, I think the hallmarks of communicating with people in trauma are clarity and choice. So be as clear as possible and give as much choice as possible.
That's great, Catherine. Communicate with clarity and choice. All 3 C's. That's great. And I think nothing could be more difficult than what we went through with COVID, right? People were looking for information, grasping at information, whether it was real or not, and then dispersing it all over the internet or email or whatever their communication vehicle of choice was. And I think that made it even harder for a lot of people to deal with this. Particularly with younger children and the elderly were isolated completely. But thank you very much, Catherine. We appreciate your comments. Anybody else?
Maybe just one thing to add on to that question, Joyce, for that Catherine so nicely sort of gave us some I think really tactical things to think about. But I guess I would just say, if you're bumping up against deep truths or hard truths, it probably means you're doing something right. The challenges around equity, they're historic, they're systemic, they are wide reaching into lots of different areas of people's lives, of government agencies. And if this was, I always say, like, this was an easy problem to solve, we would have solved it by now. And if somebody shows up to your front door with a solution wrapped in a bow saying, ta-da, here's your equity solution, you should close the door, right? It just is evidence that they don't understand how deeply complicated and historic these challenges are and where they come from. And I think, Catherine was even mentioning, a lot of the populations that are having the most disproportionate impact for things like natural disasters, climate change, poor health outcomes, right? These are also the communities that have been facing lots of challenges disproportionately for decades. So, it's not a situation, it's a sort of a whack-a-mole. You can solve one problem and 3 more will pop up. And so I guess I would just say, while sometimes uncomfortable, if as you're doing this work within your agency, your own organization, or through your projects, you're bumping up against these difficult or sort of ugly, deep truths, I think that's probably an indication that you're on the right path.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Any other comments?
I have one, and this is really, first, Catherine, great. Thank you so much for what you just put out there. It's as a former leader, it's one of my my pets. My thing closest to my heart is the people and how we accept them in. And everyone doesn't start the race at the same time. Some races are longer. So if I look at the finish line and Javier fell down at the end of the race, but he finished, I need to understand, hey, how long has Javier been running? You know, I may have run a 100-yard dash. He may have run a marathon. And those things are not right now, aren't equitable. When we think about coming out of COVID and some lessons learned, one of those is some stereotypes want to pigeonhole people as being lazy, or just cultural stereotype, lazy or not hardworking or whatever. So when they ask to work from home, maybe it's not about work ethic. Maybe it's about the experience in the office. Maybe they feel safer working from home because they're not being traumatized every day in the office by microaggressions or what have you. So when we look at the technology, we also need to look at how we set policy around technology and what are those unintended consequences from forcing policy just because the technology can't support something that might be more healthy for that individual worker.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. So now, Kevin, since we are on you right now, in what areas are you finding emerging technologies can truly accelerate identification of talented candidates who maybe have not previously been considered due to bias?
I think skill mapping and data mining from skill mapping is one of the ones that I'm most excited about. You know, and I think this is less about recruiting and more about retention. Sometimes you get stuck in a job because you've been doing a job as you've been working at GS13 in making widgets for the last 10 years. But on the side, you have all these other skills, or prior to taking that job, all these other skills. Well, through skills mapping and data mining, we can find that and maybe put you on a path that gets you out of that job you're in now and actually opens the door for us to apply that. And a good example is, when I was an active duty officer, I had a reservist who worked for me, and we were just traditional HR. This person was a medic outside. They were a doctor. And so there are all these amazing skills they brought in as a doctor, and I was put into work as a captain doing menial HR tasks. I don't say menial, but they were not up to their education level. Well, if we had skills mapping, there are all kinds of helping agencies that tie in to the HR community that this person could have been leveraged in because we were able to map those skills. The same things come from underrepresented communities. You may have, if you look at and read about the Harold, the new governor of Maryland, Moore, he wrote a book.
Wes Moore.
The other Wes Moore. And if you talk about the other Wes Moore, there, but I guess a God go I. So those guys had a very similar start. They had very similar attributes as kids. Well, Wes took this road and this Wes took that road. Some people come in with skills that we don't even recognize. So I think skills mapping is something I'm really excited about to help make sure that we get folks opportunity they may not have gotten just on the surface level.
I could just add, I couldn't agree more with Kevin with regard to skills mapping and really truly understanding skills and matching them to roles in which not just things that they've done, but things that they can be doing, I think is really critical in discovering talent within your own organization. But also from a talent acquisition use case. I think one of the really sort of unique benefits in the federal space is that most CHROs that I talk to, they don't suffer from a dearth of applicants. There's a number of applicants that apply to jobs, in fact, sometimes too many. The challenge oftentimes is trying to get those applicants applying to the right job. The real true opportunity, I think, in the federal space, and we see this in the private sector all the time, is being able to essentially turn those past applicants into assets in which you're now looking at those applicants and their skill sets to rediscover those candidates and invite them to apply to the roles that you're looking to fill. This has a tremendous ability to sort of, once you're able to rediscover these candidates, you're inviting new candidates to roles that might not have normally applied to the right job or may have been silver or bronze medalists. This is another great way to be able to identify skills within an existing talent pool, whether it's, again, your employees or your past applicants.
Well, Dan, let's go into that a little bit deeper. So how can organizations ensure that their analytics are pointing them in the right direction when it comes to equity as potential anomalous situations arise that haven't been considered before? For example, there may be geographic locations that previously have not been considered for different initiatives. And I think COVID proved that out. Once everybody went home, then agencies could potentially hire people from anywhere, right?
Absolutely. I think you really kind of have to start with what is it that the organization needs? And so, first of all, there's a policy component to that. And then there's also a skills component. Whether it's private sector or public sector, today, most organizations can't actually tell you what skill inventory they have today. They know that they have certain people filling certain roles, but they can't really sort of point to, this is the skills baseline that we have today. And they certainly can't tell you, this is what we can upskill and reskill within a certain amount of time. So I think first and foremost, it's really after you've solved sort of the policy and workflow challenges, is it's important to understand your current state and your future state of where you want to go. So that if you within an organization can surface your skill sets and you can know that 20% of those individuals within your organization can be reskilled to do job Y, then you can start to develop that talent internally, which also, by the way, helps with regrettable attrition by giving your existing employees line of sight to future opportunities within the organization. And then from there, where you have that delta of skills that you can't upskill or reskill, that can really sort of inform your overall workforce hiring strategy. And then you can cast a much wider net. I talked with many organizations, and oftentimes they want to go put a center of excellence in a certain location. And then they realize, oh, shoot, there's not enough data scientists in this location. I think having an awareness of what you need and also an awareness of the talent in that location and being able to make those matches drive the best outcomes in terms of that strategy. And technology today is capable of providing those answers.
Great, thank you. But is that even necessary today to put a center of excellence with the ability to work virtually?
I think it really depends on the jobs. I would say just generally speaking, it's not as necessary as it was before in the past. You have different flexibilities, I would imagine, for different types of roles and really different types of missions. I think, where you can really benefit from that cohesiveness of a team working together in the same room. I mean, those are the kind of things that an organization really has to be thoughtful of. And, I think that sort of analysis and decision-making starts with a true understanding of the skills and outcomes that they're trying to create.
Excellent, good. Well, there you have it. You have answer to all of our problems that we have. Megan, what advice would you share with technologies listening today who are building these emerging technologies for ensuring that the human element is included in emerging technology design and development? That was a mouthful.
Yeah, so I think it certainly harkens back to the earlier conversation around sort of baking in the voices of the people that you're trying to impact. And that's true programmatically, whether you're trying to sort of address equity issues at large, or even in a microcosm in terms of users of a system, taking into account their needs, their preferences, sort of as that process unfolds. So I think it's certainly baking in those voices as part of the conversation. I do think there's an interesting piece here around sort of outcomes, which sort of fits in, I think, a bit into this conversation, which is traditionally, I think, what's been a kind of a challenge in this space is what's sometimes referred to as sort of wrong pocket. So for impact, for looking at outcomes, a lot of times the investment is in one area, but you'll see the return on that investment in another. And so I would just say, as folks are thinking about sort of their technology investments, these new and innovative technologies, to try to take a wider lens whenever possible, to look more broadly at your impacts. And there have been a lot of good examples just in the conversation we've had today around workforce, COVID, remote work. I mean, a great example of this is we know that working women, working moms had a much different experience of COVID than some of their other colleagues. And so if you're looking to increase, women representation, particularly in technology in your workforce, those are the kinds of conversations that I think that sort of the equity lens can help spur. But if you're not taking a sort of a wide enough view on impact, I think it's easy to miss some of the potential sort of meaningful input of those investments.
Thank you. Catherine, I'm going to ask the same question of you, but also, we have been so focused in the past in technology on speeds, bits, and bytes. How would you say we can share with the technologists that are listening today for ensuring that the human element is included?
Thanks for that. I really I resonate with that question. That resonates with me. The focus on speed and precision, and I think there is something really, really wonderful about making all those deadlines and doing it, ahead of schedule, and everything is kind of lined up neatly. But one of the things about humanity is that we are kind of messy. And it means that if we actually want to ensure that we are including the experiences of real humans, we have to be willing to put up with a little bit of mess. And sometimes that means that we might not kind of hit every single one of our deadlines exactly on time. But if through that process and maybe breaking it a little bit, that means that we're able to reach more people and more people feel included, well, isn't that worth it? I think it's important that we not lose sight of the forest for the trees, not be so focused on today's deadline that we miss the overarching goal, which is trying to include as many people and bring as many users into the fold as possible.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm starting to get the hook here. So why don't we start wrapping it up, and we'll start with Dan for closing remarks.
Well, again, first of all, thank you so much for this great conversation. Learned a lot here myself and from some of these great distinguished panelists. And, I would just say, as somebody that is involved in emerging technology to sort of help solve some of these great challenges, I think, now is the time pretty exciting time, I think, to be in this particular space. In many ways, this is the most innovation that has occurred in federal hiring since the 1970s. And finally, we have some real technology out there that can help us make a difference. We also see that from a policy standpoint, whether it's the skills-based executive order or the DEIA executive order, there are some real changes that are afoot within federal hiring. And I think that ultimately will create better government, because better government really starts with better hiring and being able to remain competitive to fill the roles that are so critical. As you know, there are sort of many critical jobs across the federal government that remain open, that are not only vital to better government, but to our overall national security interests. And so really now is the time to look at these type of tools and technologies that really the private sector is able to benefit from and be competitive within the public sector, but also to sort of not only inform our overall workforce policy directives and outcomes, but create a better experience for the employees that are within the government. Oftentimes it's easier to find what's next for you by looking externally. And I think the opportunity exists by really sort of being able to give government employees the ability to really have line of sight to the career progression within government, to be able to give them opportunities for upskilling and reskilling, to work on cool, interesting projects. Because at the end of the day, the people that are in government are mission driven, they're smart as heck, we need them to stay there. And so now more than ever, we have the technologies that we can leverage to really create benefits, both in terms of talent acquisition and talent management. And so I'm excited to be a part of this conversation and excited to be a part of this space at the moment.
Hey, Meg, final remarks.
I'm gonna take it back to where Kevin started, which is, I think it's really inspiring, to me as someone who certainly didn't grow up in the technology sector and has in some ways found my way here through lots of unexpected twists and turns. But I think it really is, this panel discussion, I think, is a great example of it really does take all perspectives, I think, to tackle some of these more complicated challenges. We do our best work, I think, when we bring the best of technology with the best of our people, the best of their lived experiences. We know programs are successful when they're run by people who have a shared lived experience with the ultimate citizens that they're trying to impact. So I'll keep it short, but it was just a great, I think, little microcosm here of really trying to reflect that to be really successful here, I think is going to take all sorts.
Kevin.
Yeah, I'll take just kind of keep pulling out the thread Meg just laid out there is, I think that technologists as technology companies, we need to advocate the public sector to bring in a chief customer officer who's not focused just on technology, on the overall experience for their customer and their worker. It's very easy to have a UI UX designer and call them your chief experience officer, and that's great. But what about the overall experiences, the things Catherine touched on, things Meg's touched on, Javier's touched on? How is the overall experience that you're living going? And so having a chief customer officer who looks internally and externally might be a way for us to maybe really start to move that needle forward, because then they're going to take a look at things from a critical perspective and give that information back to leaders. So that's what I would do. If I were king for a day, I'd appoint a chief customer officer across the federal government and say, you look internal and external.
Excellent. Catherine.
I want to echo what everybody else said. It has been such a privilege to be part of this conversation, and I'm thrilled that this group is here to have this conversation. But what I'm thinking of after what Kevin just said is how we have to be thoughtful about the communities that we're serving, the citizens we're trying to reach. We also have to be thoughtful about ourselves and how doing this kind of work is impacting us. I was a Fed for about 15 years, and I have a friend who was the head of a federal agency, and she ended up having to speak to her town hall the day after the January 6th riots. And she used the opportunity to talk about the real privilege of public service and how sometimes it can be hard, that you're doing really, really hard things. You're having to face insurmountable challenges sometimes. And it can be really hard to know, is there an answer? What possible answer could there be to this situation? You sometimes are confronted with some of the hardest life situations that there are in this world. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank all of you who are working on these issues and continue to work on these issues, because we are all the benefit of it. So it really has been a privilege to have this conversation with you today.
Javier, bring us home.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. Number one, I'm excited that there's so much excitement surrounding this topic. I think it re-energizes folks. There's been an up and down, peaks and valleys, so to speak. But I think that there's really an energy here, and that there's so much excitement around it is really re-energizing me at the very least. I also want to say that if not now, then when? And if not us, then who? Right? Sometimes we place this responsibility on a certain group of folks, right? Whether the executive order said agencies should seek the opportunities to create a chief diversity officer. That's great. I think that's wonderful. It is not one person's role in an agency or one office's role in an agency to do this work. It takes all of us to be involved, right? And then the last thing I'll say is we need to, and I know it's been hammered home today, and I just want to hammer it home one more time, right? At the expense of those listening, we really need to share our use cases. We really need to share our successes. We really need to share our milestones, no matter how small they are, because a lot of folks are really passionate about this, but they don't know how to get from A to B or from B to Z, right? They're saying, yeah, I get that. I know there's emerging technologies. I know that there's an opportunity to do something. I just don't know what that is. And then they get worried and they get scared and they back off, right? So I think there needs to be, some type of platform to share these promising practices with specific use cases of how these emerging technologies and how other things that we could do can help move all of these initiatives forward.
Thank you very much. The devil is in the details, right? Execution is always the challenge that we all have. Well, thank you so much. I am honored to have been your host and your moderator, Kevin Brooks, Megan Hendry, Dan Hopkins, Javier Inclin, and Catherine Manning. Thank you so very much for your time and your wisdom today. I'll turn it back over to